begin by talking about how this, I'm sure it began as, an anecdotal tale of you asking other women about Shah Rukh and their, their fandom about this mega star. How did it turn into this, this amazing, insightful, engaging book, which is like data? I mean, it's something that you would not expect out of a book which is titled such.
Prati, I have to start by saying that the book is a complete accident. In 2006, I just finished my master's degree in development economics. I was trained in collecting quantitative data, and I thought I was supposed to go to the field, collect information using the traditional survey questionnaire. I was very excited, very young, and very foolish. I think this was when I was in my early 20s. And the first project I was working with a feminist think tank called the Institute of Social Studies Trust. And they were doing a project with an organization called SEVA, which is the world's largest labor union for women. And when I went to the field to start asking these women questions about wages, working conditions, they just looked thoroughly bored because they were unionizing, they had been fighting for their own rights. They really didn't need an outsider to come and ask them questions about their wages and work, because these were questions that they were answering for themselves. And so to make it easier for the survey process, we decided to take a break. And the way you do icebreakers and survey questionnaires, I think maybe there's some people here who do surveys, they will know this, is you start to talk about things that are easier for everyone to talk about. So I started asking everyone about their favorite actor. And lo and behold, in the slums of Ahmedabad, I met mad Shah Rukh fans. These women were making garments and incense sticks at home, earning about a quarter of minimum wage. But they were mad fans. I am a mad fan. And then I think, talking about him, I suddenly realized that the tone, the texture, the energy of the conversation completely changed. Suddenly, all these women were interested in talking to me. They wanted to talk to me about how difficult it was for them to make money to watch Shah Rukh on their own, how all the men that surrounded them in real life were like Salman, but they wanted Shah Rukh, right? And suddenly there were all these conversations about masculinity, about their love lives, about their economic lives, that just the mention of him just opened up. And so I decided to do this again, and from the slums of Ahmedabad, I was in the villages of Uttar Pradesh, again doing a survey. Again met women who were mad fans. From there I moved to the forests of Jharkhand, and there as well we were doing projects on migrant domestic workers and mad fans as well. And I decided that the set of women I met at that period, it was a very formative period in my life between 2006 to 2008, that I would try and follow them. So I decided to follow their lives from 2006 all the way up to 2019. So the book is actually 15 years of their economic lives and their personal lives. And what unites all these women is not just the fact that they are Shah Rukh fans, but I think what really unites them is that they also want to stand on their own 2 feet. And I realized this was a very unusual way to tell a story about the economy, because to be able to be a fan, to watch a film star, to follow the work of a film star, you need free time, which women don't have. You need independent income, which in our country, which is right now in the bottom 5 when it comes to women's employment trends, women don't have either. And you need access to media and markets, which are also severely compromised. So actually, we tend to think of fandom as being something silly, but actually fandom is a very useful lens to think about the economy and economic interactions, because it is also an economic activity. And so that interested me, and then I just decided to follow up. But it's been a long process. It's 15 years of constantly talking and repeatedly interviewing the same sets of people.
But you also, if you read the book, and those who are here, I would strongly recommend that you get a copy, and because it's very interesting. I mean, on the first go, when you think about it and you pick it up, you don't expect that it's going to be what it actually turns out to be. But in the book, you sort of make a timeline, beginning with, say, the 1991, where, liberalization is happening, and, it's the same time that we see the rise of Shah Rukh. So how did these 2 timelines collide, and how did you think that, this was the path that you would, follow in terms of a time structure?
Well, you know, again, it's an accident on which I was able to overlay a sense of design, because I think Shah Rukh Khan, Mr. Khan, as I call him, because one has to, I don't know him, is our first post-liberalization superstar. He announced the change in the way media would be circulated. Now, of course, we're in the OTT age, and I know in the morning there was a session on this as well. But at the time that he came onto the scene, it signaled a very significant shift. It was post-reforms in telecom, post-reforms in consumer markets. There were suddenly more FMCG goods that needed to be sold, and he was the face of that, right? Because he was selling you a Pepsi. And I actually write in the book, for a lot of women in the book who come from low-income communities, may not understand words like reform. To them, he was liberalization, because they suddenly saw his poster, the TV had, you know, lots of channels. He signaled that shift. And I think it's an interesting story of how, if you look at the post-liberalization era though, I write in the book, and all the data supports it, India liberalized for its men. Women have been completely left behind. Be it employment gains, like for example, if you look at the top 10 fastest growing sectors in the country, women only have access to less than 19, that's 19% of jobs in them. And I realized that in talking about Mr. Khan, all these women were essentially just constantly talking about their yearning for an economic freedom. So I think that's how the two essentially correlated.
I'll follow the flow of your book a little bit. You know, like you begin about talking about who is Shah Rukh Khan. So who is Mr. Khan to you, the myth, the legend? How have you been a fan? How long have you been a fan? And how did that interest translate to this?
I think he represents three things, right? One is markets, which I think I talked about, because I do think that suddenly there were all these goods that need to be sold, and I think he is very much the ambassador of that. So I think he's very much markets to me. Second, I think he represents a very different kind of masculinity, and I think that's actually the theme that so many people in the book constantly repeat, because they'll say to me that, you know, typically you have this very stoic, reserved masculinity of, you know, previous actors, be it an Amitabh Bachchan or any of the others, right? Always very quiet, not particularly sharing of their feelings too much.
Not vulnerable
Not
at all.
vulnerable at all. And I think with him, there was this big shift where suddenly you had a man who, all these women I interviewed, they would keep saying, oh, he cries these beautiful tears, he's extremely open. And in fact, I measured dialogue time that women have in his films. And you realize that women are just speaking far more in his movies. And even, you know, recent films like, say, a Dangal, which is supposed to be like a women's film, if you measure dialogue time in Dangal, it's interesting because the narrator is male, and the principal character is actually a man. He has far more dialogue. I mean, women speak like less than a quarter of the dialogue. But if you look at, for example, Shah Rukh Khan's last film, which was Zero, you find women speak 60% of the dialogue, right? So when you see women speaking, there's a sense of constant engagement, and I think that's really what he represents. I think a very different masculine. And of course, then the third is, you know, the wide open arms and the soppy, romantic candy floss imagery, which, as you know in the book, you know, again, on the surface, it all seems terribly banal and silly. But if you start to listen to the way women in villages or slums or in very difficult economic circumstances, what they derive from that imagery, that escape, that entertainment, given that their lives are so harsh, I actually now have started, I don't mock those images anymore. I used to earlier, I mean, I used to enjoy them, but I would still say, well, I prefer the Shah Rukh of interviews, right? Like when he sort of, yeah, not the films. But now when I see those films, I suddenly, to me, they are now completely associated with all these stories of all the women that I followed for 15 years and what escape they need from an extremely conservative patriarchal setup. And he's almost a rupture, you know, it's like a release, which I think these women need, because the landscapes that they're actually living in are very, very masculine and very aggressive. So I think for me, I mean, I'm a fan in a very banal way. There's nothing particularly special about my fandom. But what I think is interesting is now, I think over the years of the research, I no longer see him as a star. I think for me, actually, he holds now all these stories that I've been privileged to hear. And I think there the stories are very much about masculinity. It's a very different kind of masculine. I think that's what's really important.
I mean, you spoke about this a little bit, but that was going to be my next question. That, we've heard him say in so many interviews that I work for the myth called Shah Rukh Khan. I am an employee of that myth. But what is it about that myth that women across, lines of age, religion, caste, everybody, what is it that they all find common in him? That they, is it an ideal that he's the ideal man? Is that why they like him so much? Because there's so little else that is common between all of them. But how have they come together in this this fandom for him?
Well, you noticed right now, like I noticed as we started switching towards our session, right, like the gender composition of the audience has changed, like it's significantly more female. I think that's actually why. Because what's happened is constantly these women would say to me, he plays men who listen to women, who engage with women, where women's thoughts, their words, their needs, their feelings, their actions. I mean, it sounds really silly, right? But a woman who, young woman who's a garment worker in Uttar Pradesh, she told me, she said, oh, if you watch his films, you'll see in almost every film, he's always giving up something for the woman. So it could be an ice cream, it could be a job, it could be his life, like they'll say, where he eventually passes away for another woman's political beliefs. And so I think this idea of sacrifice, of actual engagement, is really potent. And it's a sad comment on reality. And I actually say this in the book that, we only dwell in that fantasy because we're so tired of the reality. And the reality is, as you can tell with the stories in the book, is women who are not particularly heard, who are not often engaged with very closely or very deeply, who are doing a lot of the drudgery of domestic work. Remember, India is right now in the bottom 5 when it comes to the share of men who do housework. Which is, I think, a really abysmal signal of where we are, right? And then it's interesting, but constantly I will keep hearing these young women say to me, oh, but have you noticed that he always plays these characters who are in the kitchen? So for example, there's this woman who I follow who's a tribal domestic worker. She moved from Jharkhand to Delhi, works for an expat. And she essentially says, have you seen, there's a film called Rab Ne Bana Di Jodi, which I highly encourage people to watch if you haven't. And there's a scene in it where he's basically serenading a tiffin. And she says, well, if men appreciated the tiffin that women make for them, like he does in that song, women's lives would be so much better. And, it's this appreciation of care labor, also participating in care labor. He plays men who are constantly participating in emotional labor as well. I think that's really what's salient, and what's amazing is it's salient across class backgrounds. It didn't matter, I mean, in the book I talk to women who are from different economic classes, caste groups, religions. It didn't matter, I think it was this act of actually listening, engaging with women's thoughts, with women's feelings, with women's needs, and also doing the domestic work. In DDLJ, people don't remember, but I was suddenly told when I was doing these interviews that he spent so much time in the kitchen, cutting vegetables. And I think someone said to me it was the first time she'd seen a Hindi film hero in the kitchen. And I interviewed Anupama Chopra for the book, and she said to me, we'd never seen a masculinity like this.
He was serving food to the guests at her
and
wedding.
1 minute he's like, he was chasing a helicopter, which is hilarious. And then the next minute, there's all this work happening in the kitchen, and he's helping women pick sari. So I think it was a kind of emotional availability, a kind of engagement with women's voices and feelings that I would contend we still are in a deep crisis of, and therefore the fantasy is very potent.
One of the first women you speak to in the book and you write about, she talks about needing an icon to help her nurse failure or rejection. So how does that work? And do you think this is a female phenomenon? Do you think men need this sort of support? Or is it a very, like a woman thing?
No, I think everyone needs that kind of support. I mean, I would contend that some of our icons in politics are very important right now because they like allow masculine release, being like a angry celibate warrior. But it's interesting. I think in the book you realize how difficult it is for multiple reasons for women to just hold on to a job. Right. I don't know for those who don't know here, but India right now is in the bottom 5 when it comes to the share of women's economic freedoms in the world. From 2004 all the way up to around 2017, we've had the sharpest drop globally. And right now, if you look at our richest 20%, only 6.5% of married women have a job. So most India, I think it's very important, these statistics, they're in the book, and I think people should engage with them and think about them very clearly, which is, it's so hard to hold on to a job for so many women in our society that it's not surprising to me that many of the women turn to some kind of icon who in particular is talking about how difficult it is to be professional, right? Because if you look at a lot of his interviews, constantly there are comments about, oh, you take on roles that others wouldn't, talking about failure, how do you deal with rejection, how do you deal with like career paths, so on and so forth. It was very unusual, and in fact the woman who you're talking about, she maintained a scrapbook of the things that he would say. Such as there's that one quote which she keeps always throwing at me. She kept telling me, she said, oh, don't be a philosopher till you become rich, because it was important for her to have economic stability before she sort of moved ahead. But it's fascinating to me that in that context, we essentially live in a world in which, when it's so hard for women to hold on to a job, to travel to that job, to want to hold on to it even after you're married or you're a mother, it's not surprising to me at all that these women are turning to an icon who's so open about their own professional pitfalls and failures. And so, yeah, I think that's largely where it comes from. It's this, I often say with this icon, there's almost this like supply-demand equation, right, for women in particular, which is that if your reality is going to be as oppressive as it's going to be, you will need then, and you're constantly surveilling yourself, you're constantly looking at yourself, and as women, you're constantly tackling other people's needs and feelings. Obviously, you're going to be very drawn to a person who looks at women's feelings and women's desires and their bodies very differently. And so I think that's the appeal. It has a huge psychological function. I think we don't say enough about that when we look at candy floss Bollywood films. There are huge psychological implications of that work. And I think that's the reason why they're so salient.
You also talk about this, this need for women who want to be independent, who want to be rebellious. And that's also a large, factor in which it's like common between these women, right? That they want to be independent, and that's why they look up to him. But what is it about him that, inspires all of this? Like,
so it's very different, actually based on class circumstances. So for example, you would have seen in the book, the first section of the book only talks about women who are a lot like us, right? Like English speaking, typically upper caste, come from families who are fairly supportive of women wanting to pursue professional ambitions. I think there he represents the story of the man who made it without networks, right? And you see that because, often these are women who are the salaried classes and not the propertied classes, right? Like they may not come from asset wealth, and their fathers may not have gymkhana memberships, for example, to use the example of Delhi. But they are all well-to-do, they're extremely well-educated, but they want more. And I think in him they see the story of someone who really made it without having any family wealth, network wealth. So I think that's one. If you look, for example, at the emerging middle class, which is the second section of the book, which is very much women who are the first in their families to study, first in their families to just go out and want a job or hold on to a job. One of the women I follow runs away from her home to be able to just work. And I think for them, he is very much self-help guru, coach, because he's so openly talking about how difficult it is to, have a job, be middle class, to want economic freedom. I think he's also release and entertainment. I think he plays like a different function there. If you start to go down the economic pyramid, when I look at this last section of the book, which is very much about women who are economically extremely precarious, there I think he is actually a way for women to flex their own economic muscle. So there are stories in the book of women who organize screenings of his films because the men in these fairly conservative villages and areas will not let them go and watch a film. I mean, one number I think all of us should know is 6 out of 10 people in a cinema hall in India are men. OTT subscriptions largely are for men. India has one of the largest gaps when it comes to women's access to mobile phones. So it's actually, something you and I can take for granted and is so easy to just watch a film, is incredibly hard for majority of the country, majority of women in the country. And I think in that environment, suddenly when these girls start earning small amounts of money, they have purchasing power, which is a big shift in their neighborhoods. suddenly they start to see that, well, a way to spend money is to watch him. And I think, in fact, in organizing these screenings, in running away to want to watch a
It's
cinema hall
empowering
on their
for
own.
them.
Sorry?
It's empowering for them.
It's a kind of, I don't like that word empowered, but anyway, because I think it's too layered. But yes, it's a way for them to flex their newfound economic muscle. I think that this is a generation of women who, unlike their mothers, have income of their own, have disposable income of their own. And even in extremely difficult circumstances, I think for them, he is essentially a way they can show that they enjoy watching him, of course. So I think it's very different, Pratiti, based on which class you're looking at, and even region. And I think that is actually what's interesting, right? That often when we think of celebrities, we sort of tend to think that there's this one standard icon. He's created himself with all the producers, directors, and people in like the film industry, and that all of us are just like sort of silent, mute spectators who only consume. But if you read the book, you realize actually each of the women is co-creating him. They have their own idea of him, and they've co-created based on picking and choosing different parts of his images, his interviews, his newspaper clippings, all kinds of things. And I think, in fact, his extraordinary icon is completely built on the ordinary frustrations and everyday anxieties that these women are facing, and they're projecting. So it's not like there's this one wholesale, icon of Shah Rukh Khan that's been sort of sold to all of us.
So we all have
we've
our
all
own
created
version.
it. Exactly.
Our own
we all have
version
our
of-
own version, and I think and you see that, you see glimpses of that. And I think that's why it's a very powerful social science research tool, because I say that actually when women tell me about why they watch him, when they watch him, how are they watching him, they are
tells you
never
so
talking about
much.
him.
Right,
They're actually talking about themselves, their own. Why is it that they want to watch him? It's completely related to times in their lives where the workplace or their families or their lovers make them feel unworthy or unloved. And I think there's a very important story, a more textured story around gender there. And I think that's why sometimes we should use these very unusual techniques, right, to come at some of these questions. And the book is an example of that.
You did mention like it's a way of, like economy is like the money is an important factor. But also the, like I'll give an example of Manju, who you've written about. For her, when she gets married, it's the rules of her family that don't allow her to take any, memorabilia with her. So there it's necessarily not about the money, but it's about the rules that the society is, binding her in.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, one sort of unsaid thing about this, which should be said and is said in the book, is that any time a young woman is saying that she likes, I don't know, Ayushmann Khurrana or Shah Rukh Khan or whoever, right, whichever celebrity, something that's unsaid, in a way, what she's saying is, in an extremely conservative society that is paranoid about female sexuality for reasons to do with caste and bodily purity and all those ideas. The fact that a woman is saying, I like the way a man looks, I wouldn't mind exploring something with him, frightens people a lot. And you see that in the book. I mean, forget Manju, who's growing up in a village, there's the woman who ends up working for the Delhi government from Rohtas Nagar, which is in a neighborhood in Delhi. Her father's constantly coming into her room to check if she's like looking at his pictures or what she's doing. There's such a culture of surveillance even within the family and the home. And I think that's really, to me, I think that's the unsaid script around fandom, right? Which is that when you're sort of saying, I think someone is particularly attractive, in a country where women are not supposed to voice their desires that way, openly saying it makes people very uncomfortable.
There's a line in the book, and I find that very interesting, and I want you to like tell everyone about it, where you say he isn't a feminist icon, but certainly a female one.
Yeah, it's because he did Dar and Bazigar, where he's like killing women and throwing them off roofs and putting them in suitcases and things like that. So it's very difficult. I mean, and this is, I think, goes back to what we were discussing, right, about picking and choosing. Right. Because at the end of the day, there is a large part also of his early filmography, which has some very, toxic, regressive scripts there. And even in like the lover boy roles, there's like a valorization of a lot of wealth, of ritual, of different things, right? Which, if you take what, feminist principles are meant to be, they certainly violate many of those principles. Having said that though, women still love him. And even women who are self-confessed feminists absolutely love him. And many of them would say to me that that's because, again, this picking and choosing. So many of the women in the book will say, I don't like him in Dar, but I love, the interviews, for example. And you're able, and this is this agency of gaze, right? Like you can pick and choose. I mean, we can do that with each other, and we can certainly do that with body of work and art. And so that's why he's not a feminist icon, but he's a women's icon. And he's a women's icon for all the reasons we've been discussing in the past session or so. But the reason I wrote that is because often I find I'm kind of tired of this writing about this feminist lens which tends to just think of everything as binary, like you're either feminist or you're not, and then you're in or you're out. Exactly. Right. But most of us live and operate in gray. And feminism to me is not a label, it's a practice. And the fact that these women are able to pick and choose the version of Shah Rukh that they want to deify or enjoy, that's why I say he's a women's icon, but he's not a feminist one.
There's also another very interesting aspect to him, which is, his religion, his Muslim identity. But somehow, I personally am also a fan, and I think he's handled that identity in a very secular way. Like, to me, he represents what India right now should be. So, I would want to know what your thoughts are on this.
So I mean, I have thoughts, but I want to sort of preface that by saying I think, he is a person who is out there in the world, and I'm waiting to hear his thoughts on this. But I will say a couple of things here. One is, I think it's really salient. The book came out at a very strange time in his icon. And then after that, things obviously changed. But what's interesting is not even once does any of the women, other than just at the end, nobody mentions his religion. And there are women across religions and social groups in the book. He is not, his religion is not of interest. They think of him as being wildly sexy. They think he's like this great guy. He's lots of fun. He's great to watch. He's made it, all those scripts of mobility, opportunity, movement. He is not his religion to anyone. The only time his religion came up was, as you know, there's a young Muslim woman who I follow. She was very upset that he didn't speak up during the NRCC protests. But then it took her 2 minutes, and I write about this, to say, well, actually, he must be doing something, but we just don't see it, because, and she says it's probably a very difficult time for a Muslim hero to speak, and that those are her thoughts. And so, to me, I feel like it's not just him. I think there are certain icons, they've just sort of risen above their narrow social identities. I think people love them for concepts beyond that. And I don't think for anyone in the book he is his religion at all. There are people who look at him from the prism of, a progressive India, an idea of India that we want to hold on to. I certainly do. But honestly, even those conversations didn't really come up that much with many of the women I was speaking to, because I think to them he is release, escape, an ability to exercise and show their purchasing power. He's not narrow identity. He's certainly a very different kind of man. That is a fact. But no one ever reduced him to his religion, ever. You see it in the book. And it's been 15 years, and I've spoken to his fans, male and female. And it just doesn't come up. It never comes up.
Also, it depends on how one is looking at it, like, right? Like the example of DDLJ, which is given in the book. Like, today, like, I loved it then, I love it now. But if we think about it, it's like, is it supporting patriarchy? Is it not? But then you talk to these women who are from a totally different, place and position in life than you are, and they point out something which is very amazing. And when I read that, I was like, yes, this makes sense to me. Like, but if I'm looking at it from my experience, it doesn't. It's like, yeah, it is a little patriarchal. But so it's interesting how who is viewing it is also,
Yeah, and honestly, I feel like Twitter and all have done this to us, especially, I think, the English-speaking elite, where we all seem to believe that everyone has this narrow one way of seeing, which is not true at all, right? Everyone approaches things with their own sort of sets of insights, which is true for DDLJ. So what we see as patriarchal when he says, I want your father's permission, which to me, of course, even for me, and I write about this, I mean, it is, of course, in a way showing that, woman is someone else's property and you need to sort of seek their permission. But actually, a young Muslim woman in a village in UP who's had experience running away from her marriage and then coming back and has met other people who've left and had to be single, she says, well, actually, it's not regressive. It's like the nicest thing a guy could do. And I asked her how, and she said, well, it's because it shows that he cares about her. Because if tomorrow they had a fight, the husband and wife, and the girl had abandoned her own family and run away with this guy to be married, if he cheated on her, if there was violence, if they had a fight, where would she go? Public space is not safe for women. Housing markets are not open for women. Single female housing, be a single woman here. I don't know if there are any single women here who've tried to find a house on their own. It's impossible.
It's not.
It's
not
really
easy.
difficult.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter where you are. I mean, markets don't like single women, period, in India, not at all. And so I think given that, she's basically saying, well, it's great that Raj is asking for permission because it means that even if things go bad, this girl can go back to her home. So I think what I see as being regressive and sort of conservative, she sees as consideration. So I think we have to respect that people come at it very differently. And I, in fact, have started now seeing so much of that imagery completely differently once I started seeing it through the eyes of people who are very different from me.
How much do you think these choices that he's made over these years, are they conscious decisions, do you think, or is it just who he is and that's how it's I'm just want to pick your mind.
You should ask him. Inshallah, we will
When
be on a
we-
session
yes,
with him. Yeah,
yes,
so you
soon.
can ask him in Kolkata. But the thing is, look, I actually say this in the beginning. I mean, of course, I call this, desperately seeking Shah Rukh, but it's not him, right? It's people who've been involved in writing, producing, directors. Stars are not individual stars. They are a
Absolutely.
constellation, right, of different people who then create this sort of icon that we see. So there are different stars who create a constellation, and the constellation is what we see on screen. And I think that's a very important distinction. But we have to give him credit, which is that I do think he does films where always women have a more principal role to play. I mean, you look at a film like Zero that he did, which had two powerhouse female performances. It didn't do well commercially, which is very unfortunate. But I don't know of any other hero who would do such a film where women have such a strong role. And I've told you, like, I measured dialogue time and women just barely speak. Even in films which are apparently feminist films, if you have a big male star, it'll become about the big male star. And I think the ability to even do a Dear Zindagi, right, where you let like a female co-actor shine and you do your own thing is quite remarkable. So yeah, I do think we have to give credit to some choices and decisions. But again, I think this goes back to co-creation. I mean, I wonder how much of this would have, if he had done the same kinds of films in a society that was not as patriarchal and as conservative for women, I don't know whether the potency
Impact,
of it
right.
would be the same.
Right.
I have a feeling it may not. I think the reason we, attach a lot of value to that and to the behaviors
Is
is
because
because
we
in our
live.
real lives we don't see it.
But what about naming this book Desperately Seeking Shah Rukh? Did you think you would fall into, like, if somebody hears it for the first time, it might sound like it's, I don't know, a chick lit,
Yeah,
but,
l-
or,
listen,
what was your thought
I have
process
to tell
behind
you,
naming it
it's
this?
hilarious. There is a Nobel laureate who has put a blurb that is on
He
the
has,
front cover of the book.
absolutely.
And it's a beautiful blurb. But I can tell you that anytime people look at the cover, all they see is Shah Rukh, like Abhijit Banerjee. I actually told Professor Banerjee, I said it's amazing that completely falls in the background. Of course, I think for a certain kind of reader, they'll look at that. Where Shah Rukh is such a, I think it just dominates. So yes, but having said that, I think the reviews have been really kind.
Absolutely.
And they've really just distilled the fact that the book is not about an actor. I wanted to call it Desperately Seeking Shah Rukh actually right from 2006, and I'll tell you why. Because when I first went to that slum and I met this woman and this community of women who just suddenly got so excited to talk about him, there was this like frenetic energy for these women. They desperately wanted to have their own money and their own TV to watch him whenever they wanted. So when immediately in my mind, I was thinking Desperately Seeking Susan and Desperately Seeking Shah Rukh. Desperately Seeking Susan is a terrible film, but the title I love, and right then I had decided that I wanted to capture that energy, and I think there's something about the title that captures it. But we should say that the subtitle of the book is India's Lonely Young Women and the Search for Intimacy and Independence, which is, I think, what the book is really about. Yeah.
I'll just ask you one last question before seeing if our audience wants to ask you something, which is you talk about the Mazumdar Report, right? Like, which came out at this time, and now you're talking to all these women now. What is, in your analysis, what is the change that has happened?
Yeah, so women are better fed. there's better nutrition, there's better access to some core infrastructures around water, electricity, gas. So, the big growth story around some infrastructure improvements, you see that in women's lives. Health is better, fertility rates are declining, education has really grown up. I mean, if you look at the past 30, 40 years, these are big shifts. What has remained a challenge is that right now our female employment rate is lower than what it was in 1911. In 1911.
In 1911.
In 1911,
I think we need to
yes.
say that again.
Yeah,
1911.
1911. And there's a table at the back which has all this. There's a data annexure right there. In 1911, our female employment rate was something like 33, 34%. Now, I think with the latest periodic labor force survey, in 2017, we were at 23.3%, and then that increased a bit recently. If I'm not mistaken, it's like between 28 to 30%, but we are below 1911. So India is a very odd country where actually most countries when they grow, and I get into this in the book, most countries when they grow, women work more. We've gone the exact opposite way, which is as we grew, women have retreated back into the home. Part of it is voluntary, part of it is not. It's the nature of the demand in sectors, the way the economy is growing. But there's a very serious challenge there. So I think when it comes to employment, and I think it's a very alarming situation, because if you have a mass exodus of women from the paid workforce, women are always working. Even the ones at home, they're mothering, caring, cooking, cleaning, and without that work, you wouldn't have a workforce. Absolutely. But that work is not rewarded. 66% of Indian women's labors are unpaid for. Other than a few states, such as Tamil Nadu, it's not like many states are, and I think Odisha is also considering it. There are not that many states that do transfers to women directly to sort of reward and acknowledge that work through cash. And I think there's a lot that can be done to support and acknowledge women's labor better. And the second area, of course, is women's political voice is increasing. There was a lot of conversation around it even during the UP elections recently. But even with that, we're not seeing sharp increases in the number of female candidates yet. I mean, there are parties now that are doing reservations to say, like here as well.
You have to have
certain numbers. So I think that's a positive sign. But I think women's role in the workforce and in the economy is male in India. We are a masculine economy. The latest CMI data, I was on CNBC recently and I saw, in fact, the numbers the anchors had put up, and we were talking about gender inequality issues, and they basically said, according to the latest CMI data, 11% of the Indian workforce is female. Which means, I mean, you and I with jobs, we are part of one of the most meager minorities in the country. I think we should all be given awards for it, because it's not what our society wants. Our society wants us to be at home. We choose not to do that, and that's very difficult. So therefore, we need Shah Rukh for entertainment and escape.
Well, so many personal stories just came into my mind when you was talking about that. Like even being in, like, say, a privileged urban setting, there are still things that you have to fight every day as a woman in this country who's trying to, hold on to a job.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. One of the women in my book she's a government officer. She becomes a Delhi cadre accountant. And she does very well, and having a government job is extremely prestigious in our country. But she says, I did well in the government service exams, but my family is only obsessed with what she calls the marriage exams, right? Like, you have to get married, and it's almost, there's this script that if you don't marry, your life has not started. And in fact, all the women in the book, in a way, I think they're really deviating from very traditional scripts of womanhood, because they're saying, actually, I'm a person even if I'm not married or if I'm not mothered. And I think that's a big shift in our society. And, we don't realize it. I think we think that resistance and activism is out there on Twitter or on the streets. And of course, all of that is very important. But I actually think in our interpersonal, everyday relationships, we are all, these are like very small battles. And these small battles actually have huge impacts. So when women say we want to hold on to a job, that's a huge shift, especially in many of the families that I followed.
I've asked you a lot of questions, and now let's see if our audience has any questions.
Hello, ma'am. My question is, what can make a man Shah Rukh? Not the celebrity, but the person he is.
That's such a great question. What's your name? Sorry.
My name is Subhangi Astha.
Hi, thanks. That's such a great question. I think what can, at least the women in my book, you should ask Mr. Shah Rukh Khan that question, actually, not me, and I'm not, I can't speak for him. I'm going to tell you what I think a lot of the women in my book said to me, which is listening to women, supporting their choices, and making them feel loved, irrespective of what those choices are, if they want to stay at home, if they want to follow a career, just engagement, actual engagement, which I contend, and I think the women in the book will also contend, is something I think Indian men and Indian masculinity, particularly in the North, continues to struggle with. There's a lot of, you'll know this, there's a lot of talking over, talking through, ignoring, not engaging with women. I think that's one. And then there are all the, wonderful, funny things that he himself says, right, which I can quote about hard work and sacrifices and all those things, which I don't want to labor. But I think if you study the book, one of the things that you'll notice is the script is a different kind of masculine requires a man who's comfortable with strong and independent women. And I do think that we are still in a culture that really struggles with that. Men struggle with that. I hope that answers your question. Thanks.
Anyone else? But the struggle of not being heard is so real. Like people talking over you and not being heard is
Hi,
really,
ma'am.
really.
Ma'am, I have a question. Ma'am, do you think a woman need a Shah Rukh in her life?
No. In fact, sorry, what's your name also?
Plabini.
Plangu, thanks. I actually say this in the book that I think there's a big generational shift. So in the book, because I follow these women for more than a decade, there are some mothers and then some mothers also have daughters. And the difference between the two of them is I actually say this, that the mothers want to marry Shah Rukh, but the daughters want to be him. They don't feel like they need a man to feel, they only probably need a man when there's a law and order kind of situation, because we do live in a country which is very unsafe for women. It's just true. Only parts of the South and the parts of the Northeast are probably different, but largely, broadly, especially the context where the women I'm following, largely North and the West and even parts of the East, it's unsafe. And I think that's where they need a man, be it a brother, father, whoever it is. They all just want to be him. They want his success. They want to be economically independent. They don't want to marry him. They want to be him. So yeah, that is a big generational shift, and it's an important one. Thank you.
Anyone else has any questions?
I am Shrinika and I want to ask the question, do women need support to grow?
Thank you so much. Yeah, they do. I think all of us need support to grow, no? But it depends on what kind of support. I think right now, what we think is support, Shrinika, is actually protection. It's like there's a lot of, we need to protect women because the world is unsafe. We need to, coddle them, take care of them. Support to let women leave their home and do what they want to, that's a very different kind of support. So I do, absolutely, I think all of us need support. And I think in particular, I feel all men, and you must go and tell your father, brothers, everyone, they must help in the kitchen. That's the biggest kind of support that any man can provide, because we are still, I'll keep repeating this, we are in the bottom 5 of the world when it comes to fathers and brothers and men helping in housework, and that is a critical form of support which can really help women. Because women are supporting men a lot, and I think it's time we equalize that. But thank you for your question.
Welcome.
In the lockdown, this must have been so much worse for the women, right? Like this being in the bottom 5 in the world and having no help at all.
Yeah, well, the data is very worrying, because if you look at what CMI is saying, they are finding that while most men have returned to jobs after the pandemic, post-lockdown, all of that, the quality of the jobs has declined, often from maybe salary jobs, some have moved to more precarious self-employment. 5 out of 10 working women are just not back.
They've not gone back to work.
They've not gone back. And one of the things that we need to study, what some people are saying is you see this brief increase in female employment because households are in crisis. So women in some cases need to step out and earn. But as this crisis starts to stabilize, women will again pull back. But 5 out of 10 working women are still not back. And that's a big crisis.
It's very disturbing.
And it's not just a crisis of care, I think it's also a crisis of sectors that demand work. There's a whole shift in the structure of our economy, and it's hurting women right now. I argue that if we actually had an economy that grew and focused on rewarding and supporting care-based service jobs, you would see a bigger boom as well in women's work, but we're not seeing that right now.
If anyone else doesn't have, oh, we have another question.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Hi. Hello, ma'am. Ma'am, actually, I wanted to ask a question that just quite ago you said about supporting women. So sometimes undue support actually cages in, and like we really need a fearless freedom. Also, talking about intersectionality, there are upper class women and upper caste women. But generally those who belong to a lower caste and lower class, they suffer, fourfold oppressions under that unhealthy masculinity. So what are your views on that? I would like you to enlighten us.
Could you introduce yourself, please?
Myself, Prachi Jha.
Hi, Prachi. Are you Shah Rukh fan?
Yeah.
No, you are, okay. Actually, I should ask before, how many people here are Shah Rukh fans? Yeah, that's a very low number. I'm suddenly disappointed in Bhubaneswar. Anyway, I'm kidding. Prachi, I think to answer your question, yes, I agree with, I think, everything that you theoretically said. But having said that, I feel like we should be very careful about what's the solution out of that. For the women I follow, brothers, fathers, there are other kinds of men, I mean, may not be a partner per se, who are really supportive in their careers. And there's a woman in my book who runs away from her family because she wants to hold on to a job, and it's basically her brother who helps her. And the only person in her family she's in touch with now is her brother. She comes from, not a particularly well-to-do background. But having said that, yes, women, as you start going down the caste and class echelon, of course, there are even greater oppressions. And I think in those circumstances, on the surface, what we don't realize is even for women to want to step out and say, I just want to have an ad hoc job, right? As a domestic worker, or I want to make, garments at home or something. That's actually a pretty significant change in the way the household is set up, who has power and who enjoys freedoms in the home. So things that, I don't think we should be extreme when we say freedom. Freedom can look very different for different people, right? And one of the things I think I'm trying to argue in the book is that freedom for some women in the book could just be having a TV which they can switch on for themselves, which is also very hard. And for others, freedom could be just being single and not marrying someone they don't love, right? So freedom is very different. So when you say fearless freedom, sure, but we must realize in a constrained society, freedom will be extremely structured and very layered based on your circumstances. Thanks.
Shrayana's book is available at the bookstore at the back. You can purchase a copy and get it signed by her. And she's here if you want to speak to her as well. Thank you so much for joining us here.
Thank you so much.
And we look forward to seeing you in Calcutta and
with
talk
Shah
more
Rukh.
about
Yeah,
this.
that's right. Thank you. Thanks.